Psalm 46. Psalm 46 is getting into now the second book. There are 5 books in the division of the book of Psalms. The Hebrews have done that, and have had that now for centuries. That's the way that they decided to do it. Never have actually learned what the rhyme or reason is behind it, because when you look at the Psalms that are contained within each of those 5 books, it's a mixture of different types of Psalms. And those different types can be categorized in anywhere from a few to as many as 15 different categories. And what we've been doing in this class, last quarter and now beginning in this quarter, is dividing them into 6 different categories. And these categories are wisdom and didactic Psalms, messianic and royal Psalms, Psalms of lament, what we call imprecatory Psalms, and also praise and thanksgiving Psalms, as well as pilgrimage Psalms. As I mentioned, you can divide these in different ways. I've just combined some of these, like the messianic and royal, even the wisdom and didactic, because those seem to be the same thing to me. And I've talked about this at length in many of the previous classes, and so if you'd like to know more about those types of Psalms, I would encourage you to go back and look at some of our YouTube videos on our YouTube channel that has these lessons and goes into more detail about the types of Psalms and what those mean and how many there are. And I've taken the 5 books and then divided them into those 6 different categories, and here you can see all the different Psalms and where they line up in regards to the type of Psalm that they are and the book. And so we are now finally in book 2. The first time since the whole quarter, we're going into the second book, and we're going to be in Psalm 46. And if you look right there on the screen, it should be under, there it is, all the way to the far right there, a pilgrimage psalm. In fact, this is going to be our schedule, because one thing about the book of Psalms is it's so big, it is practically impossible to cover in one quarter. You certainly can't do it verse by verse, and even if you did it verse by verse, you're looking at more than a year to be able to cover the entire book of Psalms. So instead of doing that, we're giving you some basic structure to be able to help you to understand the Psalms yourselves. And that is, number 1, knowing the different types of Psalms, so that whenever you see it, you know what you're dealing with immediately. And then the structure, which we've been looking at in every Psalm, is this poetic structure, and then getting into the commentary. Again, if you want to know more about that, you can go to our website, and I have this chart that you saw right here. This one and this one are both on our website that you can download and have those for your own study. But we are today going to be looking at Psalm 46, and as you can see from the calendar, we're going to have a mixture of the different types of Psalms coming up and finishing out the quarter with Psalm 119, which is a very long psalm and is going to require at least a couple of 3 Sundays to adequately describe and go through it. So today, Psalm 46. This psalm is such a beautiful psalm. This is one of my all-time favorite psalms, and you're going to see that it is that of several others as well. But it is the title, God is Our Fortress. And the whole point of this psalm is to inspire confidence in God's protection and in God's power. As we already mentioned, it is a pilgrimage type psalm. So that means that this is a psalm that is sung in different aspects, whether they are marching or making their way up to Jerusalem or making their way up to the temple, or as I'm going to show you here in a few minutes, even used in the worship there at the temple. And so that's why it's classified as a pilgrimage psalm. I just realized I'm still using this microphone instead of the lapel. Let me switch this on real quick. Turn this one off. There we go. Get this out of my way. Here we go. All right, so what you'll notice as you read Psalm 46, the very first thing that you read in there, it says, "To the chief musician, a psalm of the sons of Korah, a song for Alamoth." All right, well, this psalm, as we have looked at many psalms now for the last quarter, most of them have been written by David. David is being that inspired psalmist that wrote the majority of the psalms that we see in this book of Psalms. But we also know there are several psalms written by others. And in this case, you have the sons of Korah. And the sons of Korah have written 11 of the psalms throughout the book of Psalms. And these are the descendants of Kohath. Whenever you look at Scripture, especially in the book of Leviticus, whenever God set up the tabernacle worship, whenever He commanded all the things that the Jews needed to do for His worship in the law of Moses, you see Him do all kinds of things. For example, the priests come from which tribe? The Levites, all right, specifically the Levites. And then He takes Aaron as the first high priest, and He commands certain types of clothing that Aaron, the high priest, is supposed to wear. And then, of course, the high priests that come after that wear those same clothes, as well as the different ornaments and everything that go with it. He has a specific way He does the tabernacle. He has a specific way that the other priests have to dress. And in that, Levi had three sons, that is Gershom, Merari, and Kohath, are three sons of Levi. And Korah is the grandson of Kohath. And you might remember that name, Korah, from the rebellion, Korah's rebellion in Numbers, the book of Numbers. And if you go to Numbers chapter 26, verse 11, you'll see that whenever God punished the Korahites, the sons of Korah, you'll see in verse 11 it says, the children of Korah were spared. And so these are the children. These are the ones that went on to become the choir and the musicians in the temple. So each one of the sons of Levi had specific things that they did according to the law of Moses. For example, Gershom and Merari, some of them were responsible for transporting the tabernacle and parts of it. And each one had its own different duties that they had to fulfill. And so that's what we mean by the sons of Korah. And then the word alamoth, we don't really know exactly what that is, but we think that it is a high-pitched stringed instrument. And that goes or comes from what we read in 1 Chronicles 15, verse 20, which mentions stringed instruments along with the word alamoth. All right, so that's the introduction to Psalm 46. And what I'd like to do now is show you the poetic structure of the psalm before we get into some of the commentary. Because part of learning and understanding the Psalms is, as I've already mentioned, knowing what type of psalm you're dealing with. So as soon as you come to a psalm, whatever it might be, just pick a psalm and go to it, and then look to see on that chart what type of psalm it is. For example, if it's a song of lament, all right, what does that tell you? What's going to be the focus of that psalm? What's a lament? What's that? Sorrow, crying out to God, all right? There's some sadness or something going on that the psalmist is going to be talking about. If it is a messianic psalm, what do you think the emphasis is going to be? The Messiah, right? It's going to have that prophecy in it. So that's the first thing when you're dealing with the Psalms is what type of psalm is this? Well, this is a pilgrimage psalm. So that tells you a lot about how this psalm is used and what it's for. Then the second thing that you do whenever you get ready to look at psalms is I don't expect you to memorize any of these things. You can just simply go on to the internet and literally type in chiastic structure or poetic structure of Psalm so-and-so. And there's plenty of people out there that have broken it down into the structures, all right? I know y'all want to think that I'm super intelligent and I know all this stuff. No, I just went on the internet and Googled it, okay? No. It does take a little bit more than that, but this is how a lot of times you can find the information about the poetic structure. I will warn you that depending on the psalm that you're dealing with, you're going to get a lot of different opinions on it, but you just got to sift through it and then figure out what it is, because I don't fully agree with every one of the ones that I've come across because of the way they break them down. And so I find the one that seems to make the most sense that in my studies, and then try to synthesize all that together. One thing you will find, though, that almost all of them is that you will find that the axis of the psalm will be the same. Pretty much they all, no matter how they divide it out, they'll come to the axis. What do I mean by axis for some of you who may not have been in this class before? You have a poetic structure in Hebrew poetry in the Psalms that is not like our English poetry. English poetry rhymes. We'll do it in couplets and things like that, and we'll rhyme, or maybe we'll have a few stanzas or whatever that'll have rhyming in it. It's not the way poetry works in the Hebrew mind. The Hebrew mind is parallelism, and they'll start with the first line of the poem and go all the way to the end of the poem, and they'll make a parallel statement. It'll either be a synonym or it'll be a contrast, but it's the parallel. So if you see there on the screen, notice that at the very first line, verse 1 is what we call A1. Then you go to the end of the psalm, verse 11, that's A2. So there's your poetic structure. The first being letter A, you have the 1 and the 2, which shows you the parallelism. All right, and then you come into the next line, which in this case is B1, which is this. It's more than one verse. It's 2 through 5, and there is a thought that is put together in those 4 verses. You go down to verse 10, there's your parallel. So what happens is you keep coming in like this, depending on how many times the psalmist does it, to the center point that he's trying to get to. It's called the axis, and that is the main thought of the psalm. It is no different than the songs that you hear on the radio, or that you know, or that we read and use in our hymnals and stuff like that. There's always a central thought of every single song, right? So if you name a song, whatever it is, you think about it, it's dealing with one topic, one main thing. Well, that's what the axis is in a song. Does that make sense? All right. I did that again, explain that again for the benefit of some that haven't been in this class, so that you can understand a little bit what we're talking about. And of course, again, I'd refer you to our YouTube channel that goes into great detail about how chiastic structure works. So here's your chiastic structure. You see the green, and then you come into the blue as you're coming in, and then you come into the red. That's the next line, the C line, and then the axis. And so what we have here is, if we start and just get rid of the rest of it and just focus just on the first parallelism. You have verse 1, God is our refuge and strength, the very present help in trouble. Go down to the end of the psalm. Read verse 11. The Lord of hosts is with us, the God of Jacob is our fortress. Here's your parallelism, all right? Refuge and strength. Refuge and strength are words that describe fortress. If you needed refuge, if you needed some place that would protect you, where would be a better place to go than a fortress, right? I mean, isn't that what we do when we're little kids? We build a fort, right, to go up in that little fort. I used to do that when I was a kid, and we got a lot of kids in the neighborhood where I live, the Lachlan bunch, and they love building their forts. And so, a refuge and strength. And then, when you think about the word trouble, He is there in trouble. Whenever we have trouble, doesn't it make sense whenever you have trouble? The contrast of that is to have God with you. So if you have trouble, you want God with you. Are you seeing the parallelisms there? All right. I try to highlight these so that make it real obvious what it is the psalmist is trying to do. Now, if you come into the next line, all right, so we're coming in, as I mentioned, this is the way Hebrew poetry works. It works like this. It starts at each end and works its way into the center. So the next one is verses 2 through 5, and it makes a general point, and we'll break down verses 2 through 5 in just a moment. But it makes a general point. It says, we will not fear, all right, though the earth be removed. You go down to verse 10, this is the parallelism. Be still and know that I am God. If you are being still and know that God is, you won't have any fear, right? We will not fear. That's the Hebrew, in the Hebrew mind, this is what poetry looks like. This is poetic to them. All right, so now we come down to the next section of parallelism, and it is verse 6. It says, the nations raged and the kingdoms moved when he uttered his voice. We'll read the entire psalm in its entirety in just a second. And then verse 8 and 9 says, the works of the Lord. How did God do his works? How did God create the world? He spoke it, right? He uttered his voice. And so you can see that parallelism within Hebrew poetry as well. You can also see that in where it says the nations raged and the kingdoms moved. That's the same thing as the making wars. That's another parallelism that you see. And then, so what is the main axis? What is the center point of this entire psalm? The Lord of hosts is with us. God of Jacob is our refuge. It all centers around that right there. Verse 7 is your axis. So if you're taking notes in your Bible, like I do, that's what I write. The axis, the main point of this psalm is verse 7. I know a lot of people think verse 10 is the main point. That's just a verse that has been quoted a lot. It's not the main point. The axis or the main point of the psalm is verse 7. The Lord of hosts is with us. That's what the psalmist wants you to take away. It's no different than an artist or a musician who's writing a song. He wants you to take away a certain thought from that performance. Well, it's the same way with the psalmist. He wants you to take away a certain thought. And in this case, it is the Lord of hosts is with us. All right, so that's your basic chiastic structure of the psalm. Now, we've learned in the last few classes that a lot of psalms, the whole psalm is just that right there. But sometimes psalms get a little bit more complicated as they have chiastic structure within chiastic structure. All right, so they have this chiastic coming in, and then within that, there's also a chiastic structure. And so here we have a chiastic structure within the main structure, and that is verses 2 through 5. And if you go and look at just those by themselves in their own chiastic structure, the same sort of thing where you have two outer verses coming into an inner verse, then you wind up with an axis. All right, so the parallelisms that we have in verse 2, the first part of verse 2, is we will not fear even though the earth be removed. And then if you go down to verse 5, she shall not be moved, for God will help her. There's that help and the fear. And so if I come in, let me back up here. If I come into the next one, you'll see a parallelism in the second half of verse 2 and verse 3, in the midst of the sea. And then verses 4 and 5 is talking about in the midst of her. So again, these little parallelisms that are in between, and then the central axis of that section is there is a river whose streams make glad the city of God. Okay, I know that can be a little bit complicated, but for many of us who like poetry and like the structure and things like that, it makes sense. So some of you may not, maybe just boring grammatical things. But what we're trying to do is show you that it's just like our songs that we have. When we sing a song, what do we have? We have verse, chorus, and then verse, a chorus. We have structure to our songs, right? Each song has a certain way that it is structured. Same way with the Psalms. They're structured in a certain way. They follow a certain pattern, and over and over and over you see that pattern. Sometimes it gets a little complicated, sometimes not. And so in this case, we have the two intertwined. We have a major chiastic structure, and then we have an inner chiastic structure within it. Now let me show you some other things that happens in this Hebrew poetry, some words that you can see going throughout the entire psalm. Good songwriting, whenever you, and I teach this sometimes whenever talking about sermons or everything. I used to be a musician. Well, I still am a musician. I used to be a professional musician, and I used to write songs and everything. And one of the things that you learn or you teach about songwriting is that you have one subject and you stick with that one subject. A lot of times new songwriters, and you'll see the same thing happen with new preachers, I teach them that sermons are just like songs. You need to have one thought. And so, for example, if that thought is, I love you, let's say my darling, let's say, I'm writing this song to Andrea, all right? I love you. So that's the focus. I love Andrea, and I'm going to sing about Andrea, and I may sing about her eyes, I may sing about other things that are going on in our life as far as the two of us, but I'm not going to start talking about politics or start talking about some other topic. You stay on topic, and that being your love that you have, this love. If you want to talk about other topics, then make that your central topic. Same way with poetic Hebrew poetry, and that is you'll see over and over the same theme. So look at the yellow words, the words highlighted in yellow. God is our refuge and strength, the very present help in trouble. All right? Whenever you have trouble, what does it feel like? What does it feel like when you have trouble? Huh? Stressful, that's a good word. Depression. All right. Trouble. What else? What else does it feel like with trouble? A burden. Good. All those things that you're mentioning, it all has to do with kind of movement, right? It's not calm. Trouble and calm are opposites, right? So trouble, and you think about the words that are used in this psalm, that he says that the earth shall not be removed, all right? The earth being removed, that's a lot of movement, right? That's trouble. The mountains carried into the midst of the sea. They're mountains moving. You know, I watched a video just recently of an earthquake. I think it was a 6.4 earthquake over in Japan. It was all these video views of it, people just filming it. And here they are filming, and you can see cars moving and bouncing around and all these things, even buildings swaying. Couldn't even imagine an entire mountain. Could you imagine a mountain moving and sliding into the ocean? It'd be pretty scary, wouldn't it? And then you think of rivers of streams. You know, streams are something that are constantly moving. When the nations rage, that usually involves movement, and kingdoms are moved. And so over and over and over, you see these words, this theme that goes through there. And then the opposite side of that is God. And what do we have? God is described as a refuge. All right? When you think about refuge, it is a nice place of comfort, right? Going back to that idea of a fortress. And it's a place where you don't have fear. And it's not moved, and that idea of being still. Are you seeing the contrast in the poetic structure now of Psalm 46? All right. Any comments, thoughts up to this point? Is it useful for you or just boring as all get out?
I can't imagine doing this in my own reading without your colored guide sheets.
That's why I want to... Yeah, exactly. Well, that's why I do it this way, so that you can see it. It's like, oh yeah, there it is. And that way you'll start to see it in your own study of Psalms. All right, so using this right here, let's go and let's read the Psalm, and let's look at what he's talking about. All right, verse 1, God is our refuge and strength, a very present help in trouble. Now, when you think of refuge, all right, we've already talked about the fact that it's like a fortress, and that's actually what the word means. It's like an impenetrable fortress. It is a place of shelter. It's a place where you can have hope, where you can feel secure. All right, how would you describe refuge? What's a refuge to you?
Place of safety.
Ooh, that's good. Place of safety. All right, a place of safety. All right, so God is described three different things here. He's described as a refuge, a place of safety. He's also described as strength. All right, strength is something that we can certainly relate to God with, right? We can see God as mighty. How is God a strength? Y'all know the answer. Yeah. Any other thoughts about how God is strength? He created everything, that's right. Defeated enemies for Israel. He created everything. Is God powerful? It's pretty straightforward, right? God is a strength. And then it says a present help. Describes the aid that God gives whenever we need it most. And the psalm says that help comes when we're in trouble. So God is our refuge and strength and present help in trouble. So when you have trouble in your life, this is why this psalm is so comforting, because it describes God in three ways: of being a place of safety, a place of strength, and also a present help. And we need to make sure that we don't miss. This is a key point of the whole rest of the psalm. In fact, Martin Luther, pick up your hymnal here. Martin Luther loved this psalm so much. This was his favorite psalm that he wrote a song about it. Turn to 06. Song number 06. I say 06 to number 6. Just 6. Song 6. This right here is written by Martin Luther and during the Reformation age, and he is basically citing this psalm in his own way here. He's saying, "A mighty fortress is our God, a bulwark never failing. Our helper he, amid the flood of mortal ills prevailing. For still our ancient foe doth seek to work us woe. His craft and power are great, and armed with cruel hate on earth is not his equal." Now you got to understand, this was written in German, because he spoke German, and then this is now translated into English. But it's all based off of Psalm 46. It was his favorite psalm, and if you know anything about Martin Luther, with the Reformation age, had his life always being threatened. He was constantly in turmoil because the kings and the different people in power, especially within the Catholic Church, wanted to kill him. And so there were times of trouble whenever he would talk to his friend Philip, who was usually with him, and say, "Come, Philip, let's sing Psalm 46. And that's how he would calm himself down whenever he was in the midst of trouble. Interesting little side note there. Verse 2, "Therefore we will not fear, though the earth be removed, though the mountains be carried into the midst of the sea." This shows this idea of mountains moving. This is another poetic technique that the Hebrews use of exaggeration. They basically take things that really couldn't happen. I mean, they could happen, but they don't happen on a normal basis, to describe something just enormous. We do that as well. We exaggerate sometimes for emphasis. And that's what he's doing here, saying that the earth, that those mountains be slipping or moved, as that idea that despite whatever disaster there is, this person will not lose their faith in God. I mean, when do people usually have their faith shattered, or when do they have their faith challenged the most? Tragedy, trouble, death of a loved one, a catastrophe of some sort. You think about right here in our own area, we have catastrophes, right, with hurricanes. We have people in this room who have lost homes, right? That can challenge your faith. This is saying that even if something as terrible as a mountain being moved, will not lose faith in God. Verse 3, "Though its waters roar and be troubled, though the mountains shake with its swelling, there is a river whose streams shall make glad the city of God, the holy place of the tabernacle of the Most High." Now, the idea of this river that's coming through, if you know anything about Jerusalem, Jerusalem does not have a river flowing through it. It does have a protected well, a protected stream that flows into the city, but there's not a river flowing through it. So this clearly is not talking about actual physical water. It's talking about God. Because where was, or what is in the city of Jerusalem at the time of David? Well, so let me rephrase that. after David, what's in the city of Jerusalem? The temple, right? And that's where God resides. So there's God in the midst of her. So this is talking about the constant flow of blessings that God bestows upon his people. And then he goes on to say, God is in the midst of her, and she shall not be moved. God shall help her just as at the break of dawn. All right, everything else, we talked about this a minute ago whenever I put this up there. Everything else is moving, right? Everything else is in turmoil, moving. There's movement, there's action going on, but what's happening with God? Should not be moved, right? And that's one of the key words with this whole psalm. What does that speak to you? That God doesn't move. While everything else is going crazy, God doesn't move. What does that mean to you? How do you interpret that or see that? Stability. Amen. Stability. Do we need stability in our lives? I see a bunch of head shaking. You know, what's one of the first things that a mother and a father will seek for their children? Stability, right? Am I right, parents? You want stability in your child's life. Why is that important, y'all? Why do you have to have stability in a child's life? Parents, help me out. I'm not a parent, so.
So they feel secure.
Feel secure. All right. Any other thoughts on why it needs?
Stability affects the way children are able to connect with people and their environment and their community. And like, if they don't have that stability, they won't find that connection or that like safety.
Love that. All right, so security and connection. Are y'all seeing that in this psalm? If God is not moved, especially when you get to verse 10, be still and know that I am God. Wow. That speaks very clearly of why stability is so very important. All right, so then, if God is in the midst of her, and God shall help her at the break of dawn. She shall not be moved. So nobody's going to disturb Jerusalem because Jerusalem is protected by God. All right, so the nations raged, verse 6. The kingdoms were moved. He uttered his voice, and the earth melted. So there's a parallelism right there. Everybody else is doing all their things. All God has to do is go, enough. And it would just wipe it out. God spoke the earth into existence. What can God do regarding that existence? He can speak it out of existence. Have you ever thought about that? That's pretty serious power, isn't it? And then verse 7, the God of hosts is with us. The God of Jacob is our refuge. As I said, this is the axis. This is the main thing that the psalmist wants you to see. Now, the word hosts, we hear that word a lot, don't we? We sing that word in some of our songs, and God is described as the God of hosts. Jesus is described as the Lord of hosts. Does anybody know what host is? What is hosts? Armies. That's another word for armies. All right, it's exactly what it is. And it's plural. It's a typical word meaning armies. And notice that he's the Lord of hosts, plural, as in God has more than one army. Now stop and think about that for a second. Does God have more than one army? He sure does. If you look in Revelation chapter 4 and 5, you'll see this beautiful picture of God sitting on the throne, and around him are levels of, if you will, armies. First you have those four creatures, those four living beings that are described in wild ways. It's very interesting. And then around them are the 24 elders, and then behind them the angels, and then all of mankind. Are we part of the Lord's army? Right? We're part of the Lord's army as well. And so he is the Lord of hosts. Now this can also talk about either earthly armies or angelic or heavenly armies. But in any case, God is over all of them. And the word stronghold there, it says the Lord of hosts is with us, and The God of Jacob is our refuge. The New King James says refuge, but most other versions say stronghold or fortress. All right, it's a different word than the first one he talked about when he talks about a fortress, but it's the same idea. It's that idea of protection. All right, verse 8. Come, behold the works of the Lord, who has made desolations in the earth. This goes back to what was stated a minute ago about God going ahead of Israel and defeating its enemies. Nothing could stand in the way of those Israelites marching. God told Joshua that he would go before him. He would go before the armies and that they would not be defeated. They were defeated one time, right? Why was that? It's when they went to Ai. Does anybody remember that part of the story? Why were they defeated? They didn't go to God before they went, and there was sin in the camp. Remember, Achan had taken that plunder from Jericho that he wasn't supposed to take. And so there's a great lesson there. When there's sin in the camp, God's not going to fight your battles for you. All right, it's a great, that's a sermon in itself right there. Verse 8 then, come behold the works of the Lord who made the desolations in the earth. He makes war cease to the end of the earth. He breaks the bow. He cuts the spear in two and burns the chariot with fire. These are some of the most formidable weapons of the time. You think about this, in the time of David, or time around that time, they didn't have the type of weapons that we're familiar with. They didn't have guns, for example. Those were invented many, many years later. They didn't even have bombs. They had a bomb type of catapults and stuff that they would use, but the most formidable weapons were the bow and arrow, spears, and chariots. If you had an army full of those, that was to be feared. But what does he say? He says he can, notice it, he's very specific. He says he breaks the bow. I don't know if you know anything about bows and arrows, but you can ask Mike here. If somebody brings in a broken bow, it's toast, right? There's nothing we can do about it. You're going to have to get a whole new bow. Or he cuts the spear in two. Again, if you break a spear, it's no longer, you can't throw it or it's not as useful. And then burns a chariot. A charred chariot is not going to go anywhere. God can do that very easily. And then he says, verse 10, be still and know that I am God. I will be exalted among the nations. I will be exalted in the earth. Another way of saying this basically is stop. So remember what we said about all this movement that's going on, trouble and everything? They're saying stop. Just stop. Stop talking. Stop moving. Just stop. Because how else are you going to learn about God? How else are you going to build that relationship or know what it is that you need to know? You need to stop, look, and listen to God. And whenever you pay attention, then you will realize that He's greater than any of these other problems or issues that you could face. Amen? So that's why it's such a beautiful passage of this whole idea. And then he goes on and he says there, the Lord of hosts is with us, the Lord of Jacob is our refuge. This whole idea of stop and be still continues in in Psalm 47. When he says, oh, clap your hands, all you people. Shout to God with a voice of triumph. For the Lord Most High is awesome. He is a great king over all the earth. He shall subdue the peoples under us and the nations under our feet. And he will choose our inheritance, the excellence of Jacob, whom he loves. And it continues. Psalm 47 is kind of a continuation of Psalm 46. It's taking that idea of stop, look, and listen, and get to know God, and then showing what happens whenever you recognize that. So the whole point of all that is to, look, lay down your arms, put away your pride, put away the power you think you have, and submit to God Almighty, because there is no greater power. It doesn't matter what's happening in the world and all those descriptions that they give, with the mountains being moved and the wars, doesn't matter. Most important thing that you know God. It makes me think of a verse in Philippians chapter 4, verse 7. Does anybody know what that verse says? That you can have that peace that what? passes all understanding. That's Psalm 46 right there. That's how you get that peace that passes all understanding. Knowing this, be still and know that I am God. I will be exalted among the nations. I will be exalted on the earth. God's going to be exalted. What does the Bible say also? That every knee and every tongue shall confess. So he's going to be exalted. You either learn the lesson now or you'll learn it in judgment. Does Psalm 46 make a little more sense to you now? You have a little bit more useful information that you can now take to your studies, and hopefully it will encourage you the next time you have trouble and you can focus on God. I thank you so much for your attention. We're going to take a short break and prepare for our worship service.